Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. The novel opens on a cold and bleak day at Gateshead Hall, a vast mansion where young Jane Eyre lives under the care of her wealthy but unloving relatives. Orphaned as an infant, Jane has been raised by her cruel aunt, Mrs. Reed, whose heart is hardened by resentment and bitterness. From her earliest memories, Jane has known nothing but neglect and isolation. She is treated as a burden, a constant reminder of the life that her family would rather forget. Mrs. Reed's indifference is compounded by the derision and cruelty of her own children, particularly the spoiled and aggressive John Reed, who delights in tormenting Jane at every opportunity. The atmosphere at Gateshead is one of perpetual gloom. The cold, shadowed corridors of the manor mirror Jane's inner world, a place where feelings of loneliness and rejection take root early in life. On many occasions, Jane finds herself locked away in small, uninviting rooms where the only company is the echo of her own thoughts. One day, after John Reed strikes her with a heavy book in a fit of unprovoked anger, Jane's spirit is further wounded. Unable to contain the burning shame and despair that overwhelms her, she retreats into herself, and in a moment of rebellion, she retaliates against the injustice she suffers. The act of defiance, though brief, is enough to spark a small, yet powerful, awareness within Jane, a realization that she possesses a will of her own, even if it is not acknowledged by those around her. It is not long before her suffering reaches a crescendo. Mrs. Reed, in her fury and desire to punish Jane for her insolence, orders her to be confined in the dreaded Red Room, a vast, shadowy chamber where the specter of death is palpable. The Red Room, with its oppressive atmosphere and chilling silence, becomes a symbol of Jane's entrapment. It is in this room that Jane, terrified and alone, confronts the stark reality of her existence. The memory of her confinement, the claustrophobic terror of that space, etches itself into her heart and mind, planting the seeds of her lifelong struggle for freedom and recognition. The only ray of gentle kindness amid this dark existence comes from Bessie, a servant whose stern exterior belies a compassionate soul. Bessie's occasional tender words and small gestures of care offer Jane a fleeting glimpse of warmth and humanity. Yet even these moments are scarce, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment persists. In the silent recesses of her heart, Jane nurtures a desperate hope that someday she will be freed from the oppressive confines of Gateshead. This hope begins to materialize when Mr. Brocklehurst, the austere headmaster of Lowood Institution, arrives at Gateshead. Recognizing that Jane's presence is a constant source of trouble and embarrassment, Mrs. Reed eagerly arranges for her to be sent away to the boarding school. Though Jane is initially filled with trepidation at the prospect of leaving the only home she has ever known, the chance to escape the cruelty of the Reed household fills her with cautious anticipation. In a moment of quiet defiance, Jane confronts her aunt with a strength that surprises both of them, declaring that the injustices she has endured will not be forgotten. This act, though it brings no immediate relief, marks the beginning of Jane's gradual awakening to her own inner resilience. Lowood Institution, where Jane is sent, is presented as a place of rigid discipline and and severe religious instruction. The school is run by Mr. Brocklehurst, a man whose puritanical beliefs and harsh practices leave little room for kindness or individuality. The girls at Lowood are subjected to strict routines, meager meals, and relentless moral teachings. The conditions are harsh, and the cold, barren environment seems designed to crush any flicker of hope. Yet even amid this austerity, Jane finds unexpected solace. She forms a deep and abiding friendship with Helen Burns, a fellow student whose quiet grace and unwavering faith provide a stark contrast to the cruelty around them. Helen, gentle and forgiving despite the relentless hardships she endures, becomes a guiding light for Jane. Through her calm acceptance of suffering and her steadfast belief in a higher purpose, Helen teaches Jane the virtues of endurance and compassion. Their friendship is marked by tender moments of shared understanding. Together, they navigate the harsh realities of Lowood, finding comfort in each other's company. Helen's influence is profound, even as her own fragile health deteriorates in the face of the oppressive conditions at the school. When an outbreak of typhus sweeps through Lowood, the tragic consequences are swift and devastating. Helen falls gravely ill, and despite Jane's desperate attempts to care for her friend, she is forced to watch as Helen succumbs to her illness. Helen's death is a crushing blow, a moment of profound loss that etches sorrow and determination into Jane's soul. In the wake of Helen's passing, Jane's resolve to rise above her circumstances deepens. She vows to honor Helen's memory by forging a life of purpose and integrity. In time, public outcry over the abysmal conditions at Lowood leads to reform. The harsh discipline and neglect are gradually replaced by more humane practices, and the school begins to transform into a place where learning and personal growth are valued. Jane, having matured through her trials, excels academically and eventually earns a position as a teacher at Lowood. Yet, the quiet corridors of the institution, once filled with suffering, now become a bittersweet reminder of all she has endured. Despite the improved conditions, Jane's heart yearns for something more, a life defined not by misery and isolation, but by independence, passion, and the freedom to choose her own destiny. After spending several years at Lowood, Jane feels the stirring of restlessness deep within her. The structured life of the institution, though providing a measure of stability, no longer satisfies her yearning for adventure and self-discovery. With a mixture of trepidation and excitement, she decides to leave Lowood behind. She seeks a new beginning as a governess, a role that promises both independence and the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others. When a letter arrives from Thornfield Hall, inviting her to serve as a governess, Jane sees the possibility of a life beyond the confines of Lowood. Though uncertain of what awaits her, she leaves with a hopeful heart, stepping into a future that promises both challenge and liberation. As Jane embarks on this journey, the memories of her childhood, of the cold, unfeeling walls of Gateshead, of the red rooms haunting gloom, and of the bittersweet lessons learned at Lowood remain etched in her mind. Each experience, painful as it was, has forged the woman she is becoming, resilient, fiercely independent, and unyielding in her pursuit of truth and love. The path ahead is shrouded in uncertainty, yet Jane carries with her a quiet strength born from years of struggle. Her story is just beginning, and the road to Thornfield promises to be one filled with mystery, passion, and the possibility of a love that might one day heal her wounded heart. And thus, with her belongings packed and a modest hope kindling within her, Jane sets forth from Lowood. She leaves behind a chapter of suffering and enters a new era of possibility, determined to carve out a place in the world where she is seen, heard, and truly valued. The journey ahead will test her resolve, challenge her beliefs, and ultimately reveal the power of her indomitable spirit. Jane's arrival at Lowood Institution marks a pivotal turn in her young life. The school, a charity institution for orphaned girls, is a strict and somber place, overseen by the severe Mr. Brocklehurst. The conditions are harsh, with insufficient food, cold quarters, and a rigid disciplinary regime. Jane quickly observes the injustice of the school's management, as Mr. Brocklehurst hypocritically preaches humility and privation, while his own family lives in luxury. His cruel treatment of Jane, publicly humiliating her as a liar in front of her peers, mirrors the oppression she faced at Gateshead. However, unlike her time with the Reed family, Jane finds solace in friendships that begin to shape her character. Among her peers, she meets Helen Burns, an intelligent and gentle girl with a profound spiritual resilience. Helen endures punishments with patience, adhering to a philosophy of Christian forgiveness that contrasts sharply with Jane's fiery sense of justice. Helen believes that suffering should be borne with grace, that the injustices of the world will be righted in the afterlife. Jane struggles with this perspective, as she is driven by an innate sense of justice and equality. Yet, despite their different outlooks, the two girls form a deep bond, with Helen imparting wisdom and serenity that influence Jane's emotional growth. Helen's presence provides a brief respite from Lowood's hardships, and Jane begins to navigate the school's strict environment with a newfound strength inspired by her friend. However, tragedy strikes when an outbreak of typhus sweeps through the school, exacerbated by the institution's poor living conditions. Many students fall ill, and Helen, already weakened by consumption, succumbs to her illness. Jane stays by her friend's side during her final moments, offering comfort as Helen peacefully passes away in her sleep. This loss profoundly affects Jane, leaving an indelible mark on her perception of faith, mortality, and endurance. She grieves deeply, but also internalizes Helen's quiet strength, carrying it forward as she continues her journey. The epidemic at Lowood leads to an investigation into its deplorable conditions. The exposure of Mr. Brocklehurst's mismanagement results in improvements, and over time, Lowood transforms into a more habitable and respectable institution. Jane remains at the school for 8 years, first as a student and later as a teacher. Though she excels in her studies and finds a sense of stability, she longs for more than the sheltered existence Lowood offers. Now 18, she desires independence and a broader world beyond the school's walls. To achieve this, she advertises herself as a governess and soon receives a response from Thornfield Hall. With eagerness and apprehension, Jane embarks on her new journey. Thornfield Hall, an imposing yet intriguing estate, becomes her home, where she is to tutor a young French girl named Adele Varens. Adele, a lively and affectionate child, is the ward of Mr. Edward Rochester, the enigmatic master of Thornfield. Initially, Jane finds her employment agreeable, Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, provides her with warmth and information about the household, and Jane gradually settles into her role as a governess. However, the mansion's vast and eerie halls, coupled with the occasional strange sounds she hears at night, hint at deeper mysteries within Thornfield. Jane takes great care in educating Adele, forming a bond with the young girl who, though somewhat spoiled, is eager to learn. Jane finds satisfaction in her work, but there is an air of loneliness that pervades Thornfield. Despite its grand exterior, the house often feels desolate, as if it is missing an essential warmth. Jane enjoys the companionship of Mrs. Fairfax, yet she cannot ignore the peculiar occurrences in the house. Unexplained laughter echoes through the halls at night, and mysterious sounds keep her on edge. These eerie disturbances remind her that Thornfield harbors secrets she has yet to uncover. When Jane finally meets Mr. Rochester, their interaction is anything but conventional. Their first encounter occurs when Jane assists him after he falls from his horse on an icy road, unaware of his identity. When they meet again at Thornfield, Jane recognizes his stern demeanor and penetrating gaze. Rochester, with his brusque yet intelligent manner, immediately intrigues Jane. Unlike other men she has encountered, he does not condescend to her, but engages in witty and philosophical conversations, challenging her intellect. Their discussions range from morality and destiny to art and human nature, sparking a rare connection between them. Over time, an unspoken bond forms between them, built on mutual admiration and candid discourse. Despite her growing fondness for Thornfield, Jane cannot ignore its underlying air of mystery. One night, she is awakened by an eerie laugh that seems to come from the attic. She hears strange footsteps and whispers, but finds nothing when she investigates. On another occasion, she discovers Rochester's bed curtains set aflame while he sleeps. Acting quickly, she extinguishes the fire and saves his life. Rochester downplays the incident, attributing it to the drunken behavior of a servant. Yet Jane senses there is more to the story than he lets on. The strange happenings continue to punctuate her days at Thornfield, but Rochester remains evasive about them, increasing her curiosity. As the weeks pass, Rochester hosts a gathering of distinguished guests, among whom is the beautiful and haughty Blanche Ingram. Blanche, with her aristocratic poise and clear interest in Rochester, becomes the center of attention. Jane, witnessing their interactions, grapples with her own growing feelings for her employer. She convinces herself that any romantic hope she harbors is futile, given her lower social standing. The pain of watching Rochester seemingly court Blanche forces Jane to confront her emotions, acknowledging that she has fallen in love with him despite her better judgment. She struggles with these emotions in solitude, unwilling to voice them, as she believes herself unworthy of Rochester's affection. Adding to the intrigue, a mysterious visitor named Mr. Mason arrives at Thornfield, bringing with him an air of foreboding. His arrival unsettles Rochester, who becomes unusually anxious. One night, Jane is awakened by a commotion and is called upon by Rochester to assist in tending to Mason, who has suffered a violent attack. The sight of Mason's wounds and Rochester's agitation confirm Jane's suspicions that Thornfield conceals a sinister secret. Rochester insists on secrecy, instructing Jane not to inquire further, and the event only deepens her sense of unease. While her world at Thornfield is filled with emotional turmoil and unanswered questions, Jane remains steadfast in her principles and sense of self-worth. Her growing affection for Rochester is undeniable, but she refuses to allow it to compromise her integrity. She longs for love and companionship, yet she understands the constraints of social class and the potential heartache that may come from loving someone beyond her reach. The atmosphere at Thornfield grows increasingly tense, with Rochester's intentions remaining unclear. He oscillates between warmth and distance, leaving Jane unsure of his true feelings. Despite Jane's efforts to suppress her emotions, the undercurrents of passion and secrecy persist, setting the stage for the revelations and trials that will define her future. As Jane stands on the precipice of change, she remains guided by her fierce independence and unwavering moral compass, prepared to face whatever destiny has in store for her. Her journey at Thornfield is only beginning, and the secrets hidden within its walls will soon test the very core of her strength and resolve. Jane continues to navigate her new life at Thornfield Hall, growing more accustomed to its routines, its people, and the enigmatic Mr. Rochester. Despite her best efforts to suppress her emotions, her admiration for him deepens. Their conversations, filled with wit and unguarded honesty, offer her something she has never known before: a relationship based on intellectual equality. Rochester, for his part, seems drawn to Jane's sharp mind and unpretentious nature. Yet he remains distant in certain ways, often retreating into brooding silences that leave Jane puzzled. The presence of Blanche Ingram continues to weigh heavily on Jane's heart. Blanche, with her aristocratic beauty and charm, seems the ideal match for Rochester. She flirts with him openly, and Jane, ever practical, convinces herself that she is nothing more than an unremarkable governess, certainly not the kind of woman a man like Rochester would choose. She scolds herself for her feelings, reminding herself that she has neither the status nor the wealth to even dream of being his equal. In a moment of painful self-awareness, she sketches her own plain features alongside an idealized portrait of Blanche, starkly illustrating the gap she perceives between herself and Rochester's supposed affections. During this time, Rochester continues to toy with Jane in his own peculiar way, seeking out her company and provoking her into revealing her thoughts. He asks her if she finds him attractive, to which she bluntly responds that he is far from handsome. Instead of being offended, he seems amused by her frankness. Their interactions, though unconventional, continue to foster a bond that neither fully acknowledges, but both keenly feel. One evening, Thornfield is visited by a peculiar guest, a fortune teller. The ladies of the household, including Blanche, are eager to have their fortunes read, and one by one, they enter the room to have their futures predicted. When it is finally Jane's turn, she steps into the dimly lit space, only to realize that the fortune teller is none other than Rochester in disguise. His motives for the charade remain elusive, but he presses Jane to reveal her true feelings about him and the prospect of his marriage to Blanche. Jane remains composed, unwilling to betray her emotions, though her heart clenches at the thought of losing him. The evening's odd events take a darker turn when an urgent message arrives for Rochester. A guest of the house, Mr. Mason, has been attacked during the night. Jane is roused from her sleep and called to Rochester's aid. She finds Mason gravely wounded, his injuries inflicted in circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery. Rochester, ever evasive, refuses to explain the source of the attack and forbids Jane from speaking about it. Though she obeys, she cannot ignore the lingering feeling that Thornfield is home to dangerous secrets, ones that Rochester is desperate to conceal. As the days pass, Jane grows more unsettled. The Gothic aura of Thornfield, the eerie laughter she sometimes hears at night, the strange accidents that seem to occur, compels her to question what truly lies beneath the surface of its grand halls. Yet, despite these misgivings, her attachment to Rochester only deepens. She cannot deny that his presence stirs something within her that she has never known before, something that goes beyond mere admiration or gratitude. It is love, and it terrifies her. Soon, word spreads that Rochester's marriage to Blanche is imminent. The pain of this realization forces Jane to make a difficult decision. She resolves to leave Thornfield. Though she has no desire to return to the cold security of Lowood, she would rather endure solitude than remain a witness to Rochester's affection for another woman. Before she can act, however, Rochester calls for her. In a moment of raw emotion, Jane finally speaks her mind. She confesses, not directly, but in a roundabout way, that leaving Thornfield would break her heart. Rochester, sensing her distress, seizes the moment to reveal the truth. There is no engagement to Blanche. It had all been a ruse to provoke Jane into revealing her true feelings. Overcome with emotion, Jane admits that she loves him, only to be met with a declaration of equal fervor from Rochester himself. He asks her to be his wife, and for the first time in her life, Jane feels truly wanted, not as an obligation or an afterthought, but as a partner. Joy and disbelief war within her, but she cannot deny her feelings any longer. She accepts his proposal, though part of her still harbors a deep-seated fear of happiness that feels too good to be true, of secrets that remain unspoken. Yet, in that moment, she allows herself to believe in the possibility of love and belonging, stepping into a future she has never dared to dream of. As Jane continues her stay at Thornfield Hall, her connection with Mr. Rochester deepens. Despite the many peculiarities surrounding the grand estate, his character remains an enigma to her, as he oscillates between warmth and aloofness, keeping her perpetually uncertain of his true feelings. The undercurrent of mystery that pervades Thornfield intensifies, leaving Jane both intrigued and uneasy. Every night, strange sounds echo through the halls. Laughter, both chilling and unnatural, disrupts the silence, and an oppressive sense of secrecy hangs over the household. Mrs. Fairfax, ever the reserved housekeeper, avoids Jane's inquiries about these disturbances, offering only vague reassurances. One evening, Jane is startled awake by a horrifying commotion. Following the sounds, she discovers a bloodied Mr. Mason, trembling in agony. The enigmatic visitor, whom Jane had met briefly, has suffered a violent attack, yet the details remain obscured. Mr. Rochester, ever secretive, entrusts Jane with tending to Mason's wounds while he arranges for his quiet departure. The incident leaves Jane with more questions than answers. Who or what had inflicted such harm upon the visitor? And why does Rochester insist on concealing the truth? He does not confide in her, and Jane, though longing for clarity, respects his wishes and refrains from prying. Amidst this unsettling episode, Jane's emotions toward Mr. Rochester grow increasingly complex. His interactions with Blanche Ingram, the beautiful and haughty socialite, are a source of distress for Jane. Convinced that Rochester intends to marry Blanche, Jane struggles to suppress her feelings. She regards Blanche as a woman of privilege, a perfect match for a man of his stature. Yet she cannot shake the anguish such a prospect brings. In her solitude, Jane grapples with her self-worth, questioning whether love is a luxury she is permitted to desire. She resolves to stifle her affection, reminding herself of the vast chasm of social standing between them. Then, an unexpected event disrupts her resolve. One evening, Rochester seeks Jane's company and speaks to her with unusual tenderness. He asks whether she would be distressed if he were to leave Thornfield, hinting at an impending departure. Jane, unable to mask her emotions, reveals her sorrow at the thought of losing him. Their conversation crescendos into a moment of raw honesty, with Rochester confessing his deep affection for Jane and rejecting Blanche entirely. Overwhelmed yet exhilarated, Jane accepts his proposal, barely believing the turn of fate that has brought them together. In the days leading up to their wedding, Jane is the happiest she has ever been. Yet an unshakable sense of foreboding lingers. The peculiar happenings at Thornfield intensify, and a terrifying encounter nearly unravels Jane's bliss. One night, as she sleeps, she awakens to find a ghastly figure in her room. The woman, wild-eyed and grotesque, tears Jane's veil in two before disappearing into the shadows. Jane is paralyzed with fear, and though Rochester comforts her, he offers little explanation beyond claiming it was an unfortunate servant, Grace Poole, under the influence of drink. On the day of the wedding, the culmination of these strange events comes to a dramatic head. As Jane and Rochester stand at the altar, ready to be joined in matrimony, a thunderous objection shatters the ceremony. Mr. Mason, accompanied by a solicitor, steps forward with shocking revelations. Mr. Rochester is already married. His wife, Bertha Mason, is very much alive and has been hidden away in the attic of Thornfield Hall, under the care of Grace Poole. The very woman who had invaded Jane's chamber was none other than Bertha herself, Rochester's secret wife. Jane is devastated. The truth shakes her to her core, undoing all her dreams of happiness. Rochester, desperate to explain himself, pleads for her understanding. He recounts his past, how he was deceived into marrying Bertha, a woman whose descent into madness became apparent soon after their union. He had confined her for both her safety and that of others, yet the secret had weighed heavily upon him. He insists that he truly loves Jane, that his feelings for her are real, but the law deems their union impossible. Heartbroken and shattered, Jane cannot accept such a morally fraught arrangement. She loves Rochester deeply, but her principles will not allow her to remain at Thornfield under such circumstances. She knows that to stay would compromise her integrity, and so, with a heavy heart, she makes the painful decision to leave. At dawn, with no clear destination, Jane sets off into the unknown, choosing a path of solitude over a love tainted by deception. As she departs Thornfield, Jane's future is uncertain, yet her spirit remains resolute. She does not know where her journey will take her, only that she must forge ahead, guided by her unwavering sense of morality and self-respect. Her love for Rochester remains, but she cannot be with him under false pretenses. With the world stretched out before her, Jane embarks on the next chapter of her life, determined to find her own place beyond the shadows of Thornfield Hall. As Jane finds herself increasingly drawn to Mr. Rochester, their interactions grow more complex and emotionally charged. Despite his initial gruffness, Rochester begins to show a softer side, engaging Jane in deep conversations that challenge and inspire her. She senses a connection between them, yet social conventions and personal insecurities keep her emotions in check. Still, the mysteries surrounding Thornfield Hall loom large in her mind. Strange laughter echoes through the corridors at night, and the incident involving Mr. Mason's violent attack only intensifies her unease. Rochester remains evasive about the true nature of these occurrences, leaving Jane to speculate about the secrets hidden within the grand estate. Jane's internal conflict deepens when Rochester, seemingly to test her feelings, lavishes attention on the beautiful but haughty Blanche Ingram. The aristocratic Blanche, with her striking beauty and social standing, appears the perfect match for Rochester. Yet Jane sees through her superficial charm. Blanche is dismissive of those she deems beneath her, and shows little genuine affection for Rochester beyond his wealth and status. Jane, on the other hand, struggles with her emotions, knowing that her love for Rochester is unlikely to be reciprocated in the way she desires. Her growing despair leads her to question whether she should leave Thornfield to protect herself from inevitable heartache. Just as Jane resolves to maintain her composure, Rochester's behavior takes an unexpected turn. He begins to seek her company more frequently, displaying a tenderness that confuses her. Their conversations become more personal, and his apparent admiration for her intelligence and strength only fuels her emotional turmoil. One evening, under the pretense of seeking advice, Rochester asks Jane whether he should marry Blanche. Though her heart aches at the question, Jane responds with honesty, advising him to follow his own desires rather than social expectations. Despite her measured response, Rochester seems dissatisfied, hinting at deeper emotions he has yet to express. Before their relationship can reach a resolution, Jane receives troubling news from Gateshead. Her cruel aunt, Mrs. Reed, is gravely ill and has requested Jane's presence. Despite the suffering Mrs. Reed inflicted upon her during childhood, Jane's compassionate nature compels her to return. At Gateshead, she finds her cousins, Eliza and Georgiana, as detached and self-absorbed as ever. Mrs. Reed, now weakened and tormented by guilt, confesses a long-hidden secret. Jane's uncle, Jane Eyre, had once sought to adopt her, offering her a life of wealth and comfort. Out of spite, Mrs. Reed withheld the letter and never informed Jane of the opportunity. Though deeply hurt by this revelation, Jane chooses to forgive her aunt, embodying the grace and resilience that define her character. Soon after, Mrs. Reed passes away, leaving Jane to reflect on the nature of forgiveness and the strength she has gained through adversity. Returning to Thornfield, Jane is met with an atmosphere of urgency and transformation. Rochester's demeanor has changed, and his interactions with her carry a new intensity. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, he finally confesses his love for Jane and proposes marriage. Overwhelmed with joy and disbelief, Jane initially struggles to accept that Rochester truly desires her, not as a passing fancy, but as his equal and partner. However, his passionate declarations convince her of his sincerity, and she agrees to become his wife. Their engagement is marked by a blissful yet uneasy period. Rochester showers Jane with extravagant gifts, eager to elevate her status to one befitting his bride. However, Jane resists such indulgences, insisting on maintaining her independence and modesty. As their wedding day approaches, Jane cannot shake the feeling that something remains amiss. Thornfield's mysteries have not been fully unraveled, and an unspoken tension lingers in the air. On the morning of their wedding, Jane's forebodings prove true. Just as she and Rochester stand before the altar, a shocking interruption halts the ceremony. Mr. Mason, the man Jane once helped tend to after a brutal attack, bursts into the chapel, accompanied by a solicitor. With undeniable evidence, Mason reveals that Rochester is already married to a woman named Bertha Mason. The revelation sends shockwaves through the congregation, and Jane's world shatters in an instant. Rochester, desperate to explain himself, takes Jane and the others back to Thornfield, where he unveils the dark secret that has haunted him for years. In a hidden chamber on the upper floor of Thornfield resides Bertha Mason, Rochester's wife, who has long suffered from violent madness. He explains that he was deceived into marrying her in his youth, unaware of the hereditary insanity that plagued her family. When her condition worsened, he confined her to Thornfield under the care of a servant, Grace Poole. The laughter and eerie disturbances that Jane had encountered were Bertha's doing, evidence of the tormented existence Rochester had tried to keep hidden. He pleads with Jane for understanding, arguing that his marriage to Bertha is one of obligation, not love, and that his heart belongs solely to Jane. Though deeply anguished by the truth, Jane knows she cannot compromise her principles. Despite her love for Rochester, she refuses to become his mistress, unwilling to forsake her moral integrity. With immense sorrow, she makes the heartbreaking decision to leave Thornfield, venturing into an uncertain future with nothing but her resolve and self-respect to guide her. As she walks away from the life she had longed for, she understands that true love cannot come at the cost of one's soul, and she must find her own path, no matter how painful the journey ahead may be. Jane's world is shattered when she uncovers the truth about Rochester's past. Standing at the altar, ready to commit herself fully to the man she loves, she is interrupted by the shocking revelation that Rochester is already married. The mysterious happenings at Thornfield Hall, the eerie laughter in the corridors, and the unsettling events she had witnessed all point to one harrowing truth. His wife, Bertha Mason, is alive and locked away in the attic of Thornfield, hidden from society due to her madness. Richard Mason, Bertha's brother, exposes Rochester's secret, forcing Jane to confront the reality that she had unknowingly stepped into a tangled web of deception and despair. Rochester, desperate to explain himself, leads Jane and the wedding guests to the attic, where they meet Bertha, a wild, violent woman, consumed by insanity. Jane, horrified and heartbroken, listens as Rochester recounts the tragic circumstances of his marriage. He had wed Bertha in Jamaica, unaware of her hereditary madness, and had been trapped in a loveless, torturous union ever since. Left with no choice, he confined her under the care of Grace Poole, a servant tasked with managing her unpredictable outbursts. He had believed he could still find happiness with Jane, justifying his actions by claiming his marriage was a mere technicality. But Jane, guided by her unwavering moral compass, knows she cannot stay. Overcome with grief and betrayal, Jane retreats to her room, wrestling with with the agonizing choice before her. She still loves Rochester, but she cannot allow herself to become his mistress, nor can she condone the dishonesty that has led to this moment. Her principles and sense of self-worth demand that she leave, despite the pain it will bring. The next morning, before anyone else awakens, she slips away from Thornfield with no clear destination, driven only by the need to escape and preserve her dignity. Alone and destitute, Jane wanders the countryside, enduring hunger, exhaustion, and the uncertainty of an unknown future. She walks for miles, pleading for work or shelter, but finds only rejection and indifference. Her resilience is tested as she reaches the brink of collapse, nearly perishing from exposure and starvation. Just as she loses hope, she is taken in by the Rivers family, St. John, Deanna, and Mary, who offer her shelter and kindness. Unaware of her true identity, they see in her a strong and intelligent woman, and she gradually begins to rebuild her strength and sense of self. As she recovers, Jane earns her keep by working as a teacher at a small village school established by St. John, a devout and ambitious clergyman. Though the work is humble, she finds a sense of peace and independence, removed from the torment of her past. St. John, ever perceptive, notices Jane's inner strength and intelligence, and over time, he grows to admire her. However, his admiration is not one of passion, but of practicality. He sees in Jane a potential partner for his missionary work in India. He proposes marriage, offering her a life of service and purpose, yet devoid of love and warmth. Jane, grateful for his kindness, but unable to ignore her own heart, refuses. Though she respects his dedication, she knows she cannot live a life without passion or true companionship. She yearns for love, not duty, and her thoughts constantly drift back to Rochester. Torn between duty and desire, she prays for guidance, searching for the path that will lead her to true fulfillment. One fateful night, as she stands at the crossroads of her future, she experiences something inexplicable, a supernatural moment in which she hears Rochester's voice calling out to her across the distance. The experience is so powerful, so overwhelming, that she knows she must return to Thornfield. Trusting her instincts, she follows the pull of her heart, setting off on a journey back to the place where her love story began. Unsure of what she will find, but certain that she must know the truth. When she finally arrives at Thornfield, she is met with a sight she never expected. The grand estate is in ruins, its once imposing structure reduced to ashes. She soon learns from a nearby innkeeper that the house had been destroyed in a great fire started by Bertha Mason. In a final act of madness, Bertha had set Thornfield ablaze before leaping to her death from the rooftop. Rochester, in his attempt to save her, had been severely injured, losing his eyesight and one of his hands. He now resides in a secluded house, Ferndean Manor, living in isolation and despair. Jane wastes no time in seeking him out. When she finds Rochester, he is a broken man, both physically and emotionally. Stripped of his former arrogance and vitality, he believes himself undeserving of Jane's love. But Jane, having endured her own trials and emerged stronger, sees past his injuries to the man she has always loved. She reassures him that she has returned not out of pity, but of her own free will, and that their love can still endure despite everything that has happened. In the quiet sanctuary of Ferndean, Jane and Rochester find their way back to each other. He, humbled and grateful, accepts her love without resistance, knowing now that true love is built on trust and equality. No longer the proud and controlling figure he once was, he allows Jane to guide him, and in doing so, they finally achieve the balance they had both longed for. With their past suffering behind them, they embark on a new chapter, one of mutual devotion, understanding, and true partnership. Jane's journey has led her through pain and hardship, but she emerges stronger, wiser, and more certain of herself than ever before. In choosing Rochester on her own terms, as an independent and self-possessed woman, she reclaims her destiny and secures the happiness she always sought. Jane's return to Thornfield is filled with trepidation and longing. After months away, she finally approaches the grand estate, eager yet uncertain about what she will find. However, as she arrives, she is met with a devastating sight. Thornfield Hall stands in ruins, a charred remnant of the place she once knew. The blackened walls and skeletal remains of the mansion tell a tragic story, one that she is desperate to uncover. Seeking answers, she soon learns from a local innkeeper the shocking details of what transpired in her absence. It is revealed that Bertha Mason, the hidden wife of Mr. Rochester, had set the house ablaze in a final act of madness. In the chaos, Rochester had heroically tried to save her and the remaining servants, but in the attempt, he was left injured and blinded. The news shakes Jane to her core. Despite all that has happened, her heart still belongs to Rochester, and she is determined to find him. Guided by the innkeeper's account, she journeys to Ferndean, the secluded home where Rochester now resides in isolation. When Jane reaches Ferndean, she finds Rochester greatly changed. Once a man of imposing presence and brooding charm, he is now a humbled figure, physically weakened and haunted by his losses. His blindness and injuries have confined him to a quiet, reclusive existence. Upon seeing Jane, he is overcome with disbelief and emotion. He fears she has returned out of pity, but Jane reassures him that her love is steadfast. The barriers of social status, wealth, and secrecy that once stood between them have vanished. In this moment, their love is renewed, built not on illusion but on equality, trust, and resilience. Jane takes on the role of Rochester's caretaker, and with time, he regains a sense of hope and joy. Their union is no longer one of mystery and longing, but of companionship and genuine devotion. They marry in a quiet, intimate ceremony, far from the complications that once plagued their relationship. In the years that follow, they find peace in each other's company. Rochester slowly recovers some of his vision, allowing him to see their firstborn son. For the first time in her life, Jane experiences true happiness, feeling a sense of belonging and purpose that had long eluded her. Jane's journey has been one of self-discovery and defiance against societal constraints. From her early years at Gateshead, where she endured cruelty and neglect, to Lowood, where she faced hardship and loss, she remained resilient. Her time at Thornfield exposed her to passion and heartache, testing her moral compass. Even when presented with the comfort of wealth and security with St. John Rivers, she chose the path that aligned with her heart rather than one dictated by obligation. Her return to Rochester was not a surrender, but a conscious decision to embrace a love that had matured and endured through trials. The novel's themes resonate deeply, addressing issues of independence, morality, and self-worth. Jane refuses to be confined by the expectations of her time, challenging the rigid social hierarchy that seeks to define her place. Her refusal to to be Rochester's mistress, her rejection of St. John's vision of duty without love, and her eventual return to Rochester on equal terms all highlight her unwavering commitment to her own principles. She does not settle for less than she deserves, making her one of literature's most compelling heroines. The role of women in society is central to Jane's story. In a time when women had limited autonomy, Jane asserts her right to make choices about her own life. Her intellect, emotions, and desires are just as valid as those of the men around her. The novel also explores the different ways women navigate their roles, from the submissive and saintly Helen Burns to the ambitious and dutiful St. John Rivers sisters, Deanna and Mary. Each woman's fate reflects the varying paths available to them in a patriarchal society, with Jane forging a path uniquely her own. Religion and morality are woven throughout Jane's experiences, influencing her decisions and shaping her worldview. While Helen Burns advocates for passive endurance and forgiveness, St. John represents a rigid and extreme version of religious duty. Jane finds a balance between these perspectives, embracing faith and integrity while also asserting her right to personal happiness. Her moral strength is not about blind obedience, but about standing firm in her beliefs, even when faced with difficult choices. Social class and wealth are constant forces in the novel, affecting Jane's relationships and opportunities. Her humble beginnings make her an outsider in the grand world of Thornfield, and yet she never allows her lack of status to diminish her self-worth. Rochester's initial treatment of her as an intellectual equal rather than a social inferior sets their love apart from conventional Victorian romances. However, it is only after Jane gains her inheritance and Rochester loses his wealth and sight that they come together as true equals, emphasizing the novel's rejection of materialism as the foundation of love and respect. Bertha Mason's presence in the novel raises important questions about mental illness, colonialism, and the treatment of marginalized individuals. Locked away in the attic, she serves as both a literal and symbolic barrier to Jane and Rochester's happiness. Her character embodies Victorian fears of the madwoman, while also exposing the hypocrisy of Rochester's actions. His attempt to keep her a secret, rather than confront the reality of their marriage, is a failure of honesty and responsibility, one that he must reckon with before he can truly be with Jane. Bertha's tragic fate, while unsettling, forces Jane and Rochester to rebuild their love on new terms, free of deception. The novel's ending is both satisfying and reflective of its broader themes. Jane's journey is not about finding love alone, but about finding herself. By remaining true to her values, she achieves a life of fulfillment. Rochester, once tormented by his past, finds redemption through his suffering and Jane's unwavering love. Their marriage is not a fairy tale resolution, but a testament to the power of resilience, choice, and mutual respect. Jane Eyre remains a powerful exploration of identity, love, and autonomy. Its message continues to resonate, inspiring readers to seek self-respect, independence, and the courage to define their own paths. The novel challenges conventions, embraces complexity, and affirms the enduring strength of the human spirit.